We're in the book of Matthew. Probably more than any other, well, no, I can't say that because I'm thinking, I've taught a lot in the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of John. Luke probably is my least amount of time of the Gospels I've spent in, but Luke is a great study. After the book of Matthew, I've thought, and y'all can give me your feedback, when we finish Matthew, I thought what I would like to do is have a study that I want to call Luke Acts, so that we can look at significant themes because in some of the older Bibles, years and years ago, in different places all over the world, years and years ago, Luke Acts was together as one volume. In our English tradition of the Bible, those two have been separated. And that's kind of unfortunate because what it makes us do is that we always read Luke separately from Acts. And if we could just get in our mind and just always say Luke Acts, we realize it's a 2-volume work, and there are some wonderful and fantastic connections between Luke and Acts. And we may go that route. So let me know if you think that's something that would appeal to you and that we'd be able to learn some significant things related to the Christian life. As we were finishing chapter 8 of Matthew, we began to realize there were some significant things just in this chapter. We talked about Jesus seeing the crowds, and there are people who came up to Jesus and addressed him as teacher. A wonderful study could be, if you wanted to do it in depth, to look at all the different dynamics that made Jesus a great teacher. Sometimes he will refer to just day-to-day events, things that are so commonplace that it's quite amazing that he could refer to them to talk about deeper spiritual things that obviously you can't see on the surface. And we're going to refer to one of those when we get to our lesson this morning in the sermon on Matthew 13. But when we think about Jesus' parables or his stories, he'll talk about things like seeds, pearls, plants growing, farmers. He'll talk about landowners and tenants. I mean, he uses just everyday examples to make powerful insights into what the kingdom of God is about. Well, as a teacher, Jesus, we saw this at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, chapter 7. Jesus taught them differently than the scribes and Pharisees, so much so that Matthew tells us that the crowds were amazed at his teaching because they perceived that he had authority, not as the scribes and the Pharisees. And I've often wondered, okay, if you were there listening to Jesus, what could you pick up on that would tell you he had authority that the other religious leaders didn't have? Well, here's one thing, and as Matthew records it, he sort of assumes you know this because of Jewish practice. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus does not quote one single rabbi. And that was totally different from what they were used to. If you were a good teacher, you knew what all the rabbis said. And on any given topic, you knew what the controversies were and which rabbi took which position. That's just how you did it. Well, when Jesus comes along, he doesn't do any of that. He is giving a lesson straight from himself as the source and the authority. And I think it probably shocked his audience. They weren't used to that. I also get the feeling, I can't prove this, but I have a theory, that there was something about his tone of voice and the way he looked at the crowd and the way he told the stories and the way he preached that just came off with authority that they weren't used to either. Something about him, both his presence, his tenor of voice, the way he presented his lesson, all of that. They had never heard this before. And it's no wonder that they responded the way that they did. Now, Jesus then invites his audience to follow him. And this idea of following Jesus is crucial for discipleship. The Gospel of Mark picks up on this and is a little bit even, the language is even a little bit more focused in that often Mark will say, Jesus will say, follow after me. Not just follow me, but follow after me. So this idea of following, and this morning as I was thinking through this, I thought, there are interesting dynamics about following someone. Let's think about this for a moment. I can remember occasions when I was growing up, I got in the worst trouble because I followed my first cousin. He would say, let's go do this. Well, I'd follow him. And after a while, I kind of wised up. Sometimes it takes a while for me to learn lessons. But then every time he said, well, let's go do something. And then I got to where I was like, now wait a minute. If I go with him and we go do that, how's that going to end up for me? I had to start thinking in those terms. And you may have been like that growing up, that there were people that you loved to follow, but you got into trouble when you did. Following someone, interesting. When you follow someone, we may often assume they know where they're going. I will never forget when my mother was in the hospital at Cape Girardeau. Any of you been to the city of Cape Girardeau up in Missouri recently? Okay, so Patty may know this. Cape Girardeau is an interesting town because the hospital sits up on the hill. And the town is right next to the main highway, and it's not too far away from the interstate. But I don't know what there is about the way the roads are laid out. On three occasions, my sister, my brother, and my brother-in-law asked me to follow them every single time I got lost in Cape Girardeau. And it's not a huge city, but it's just kind of the way it's laid out. Every single time I'd get lost. The only way that I could find my way back was I'd look up and I'd see the hospital up on the hill. So as long as I could keep my eye on the hospital, I knew kind of where I was. And sometimes we've all had the experience of following someone in your car and you get lost, okay? So we assume often that people know where the other person's going when they say, follow me. It's a huge assumption because you can get lost if they don't. And so this imagery of Jesus inviting his followers, or inviting his listeners to follow him, is probably one that we need to revisit often. What does it mean to follow Jesus? And when you ask that question, it's fascinating that in the Gospels, all four of them, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, about 90 times total. Now think about that. 90 times there is the expression of Jesus either inviting people to follow him or just the observation that people are following him. Like, really? And so I want us to look at this morning, these are most of the passages in the Gospel of Matthew. I know we're not going to be able to work through them all, but let's look at some of these and see if we can get some significant insights into asking the question, what does it mean to follow Jesus? Now, there's also an assumption of a prior question, and I want to throw it out because I think it's so critical. Do I really want to follow him in the first place? Some people don't. I don't want to follow Jesus. It was a shock to me several years ago. There was a couple in the congregation where we were working. His wife came up to me and said, my husband really needs to study about Jesus. Would you love to study with him? I said, sure. So I sat down with this gentleman, and over the course of, we took a chapter out of the Gospel of John every week. So it took about 22 weeks or so. We studied through the Gospel of John. And at the end, I wanted him to at least in his heart, to be able to follow Jesus. And I said, well, what do you think of Jesus? He said, well, it's pretty clear to me that either he's a liar, a lunatic, or a legend. And in all three cases, I don't want to follow him. I said, what? I said, well, wait a minute. We've sat 22 weeks. We've gone through the Gospel of John. You don't want to follow Jesus? He said, No, because what I think I understand about Jesus is he demands too much of me, and I'm not ready to follow that. Well, at least he was honest. That was incredible. Here's what it made me realize. I think he got who Jesus was. He really understood who Jesus was. He just wasn't ready to go that route and give his life to Jesus. So that earlier question that we presume is, do I really want to follow Jesus? And in the Gospels, you'll find people that don't want to. And it's been that way ever since. Look in chapter 4. Isn't it interesting in Matthew chapter 4, we've got 4 references in Matthew 4 of following Jesus. Matthew chapter 4, beginning with verse 19. And of course, this is the original call. As Jesus was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw 2 brothers, Simon called Peter, and his brother Andrew. They were casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. Come follow me, Jesus says, and I'll send you out to fish for people. They're fishing for fish. Remember the comment I made earlier, there's some really neat everyday things that he will use. It's interesting that here are these 2 fishermen, and capitalizing on that moment, he says, now, I know you're fishing for fish, but if you follow me, I'll help you learn how to fish for men. Ooh, fishing for men. Wonder what that's going to look like. Well, as Jesus spends time with them for 3.5 years, he's going to teach them what it means to fish for men. I'll send you out to fish for people. At once they left their nets and followed him. Does it seem strange to you that they're out fishing, and here is this guy that comes along and invites them to follow him, and they just get up and they leave? Like, really? That's their business. Boats are expensive, so are nets. You don't just up and leave that stuff. They up and left. I think the reason that's significant is we begin to get a hint, and we're going to see it all through Matthew, that if you're going to follow Jesus, there's going to be some cost. And in some cases, his original disciples left everybody, everything they knew, everything they owned to follow Jesus. And it raises then the question that the Gospel of Matthew is going to answer. And it's that question, what is the cost to me personally if I'm going to follow Jesus? And Matthew helps us answer that question. But this is the initial call in chapter 4, verses 19 and 20. Look at verse 22. Going on from there, he saw 2 other brothers, James the son of Zebedee and his brother John. They were in a boat with their father Zebedee, preparing their nets, or mending their nets. And Jesus called them, and immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. I've often wondered if we'd had a video of that moment, the expression on the father's face. Like, where are you guys going? You know, they spent all this time working with their father, fishing, preparing the nets. All of a sudden, this man named Jesus shows up. Come follow me. They get up, leave their father, and go. I can't imagine what their father would have thought. And then verse 25. And this is important because it recognizes early on here in the book of Matthew the relationship that Jesus sustains with the larger crowds in his ministry. He's going all through Galilee, teaching in their synagogues. People see good news about him spread all over Syria. So people started bringing their sick and those who had diseases and who needed to be healed. They're suffering severe pain, demon-possessed. They had seizures and they were paralyzed. He healed them all. Large crowds from Galilee and the Decapolis. And actually the Decapolis, for years I always thought that was the name of the city. It's not. It's a reference to 10 Roman cities. In a big circle, they were called the Decapolis, the 10 cities. But Jerusalem, Judea, and the region across the Jordan, notice the crowds from all these cities and regions followed him. There was a significant part of Jesus' ministry where large crowds tagged along behind him. And it's out of those crowds that sometimes Jesus will have moments and opportunities to teach. Sometimes out of the crowd, somebody would come forward and address Jesus personally, and he would respond to that. And that became then sort of a teaching moment, so that the crowd that was there, that was close enough to hear and to see what was going on, they could receive the lesson from what was going on. Now, chapter 8. When Jesus came down from the mountainside, and that's the Sermon on the Mount, remember, large crowds followed him. Another reference to the large crowds following Jesus. This is even after he has taught. And notice, out of that crowd, a man with leprosy came and knelt down in front of him and said, "Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean." So again, we've seen that dynamic happen over and over. Look at verse 10. And this is the faith of the centurion that we looked at earlier. When Jesus heard this, that's the reply from the centurion, he was amazed, and he said to those following him. So see, there are people there. So when he sees the faith of the centurion, he gives a lesson. "Truly I tell you, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith." Now, in a way, to his audience, that may have been a slight slap in the face, because they weren't Roman. They were not like the centurion. And Jesus sees in the centurion what he's been looking for in the crowds. And he hadn't seen that much. "And I say to you that many will come from the east and the west and will take their places at the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the subjects of the kingdom will be thrown outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." And so out of the crowds then, Jesus is saying to those who follow him, he's teaching them this moment. It's a golden moment. He's going to capitalize with the faith of the centurion. And then we looked at, and this is what set us up for our lesson for today. You may remember in Matthew 8:18 through 22, the cost of following Jesus. He sees the crowd around him. He gave orders to cross the other side of the lake. Then a teacher of the law came to him, and he said, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." Here's another thing that's interesting about the cost of following Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew. Peter has to learn it the hard way. This teacher, or this individual who came up to Jesus said, "Teacher, I'll follow you wherever you go." There's an element in the Gospel of Matthew where it is clear that people may say that at the beginning, "Yes, count me in." They don't have a clue what they're asking for. They don't know what the cost of following Jesus is. Even though up front they're saying, "Yes, count me in. I will be able to follow you." And Jesus says, "Well, foxes have dens and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head." I wonder if this particular individual got it when Jesus said that. Another disciple said to him, "Lord, let me first go and bury my father." But Jesus said, "Follow me, let the dead bury their own dead." Now, there's been a lot of response to that statement by Jesus through the years, by interpreters, who will make the claim, boy, Jesus was so insensitive at this point. Jesus was just insensitive. What do you mean, go let the dead bury their dead? Well, you have to understand, in Jesus' teaching, we've seen, and this will be a neat exercise if we ever wanted to do it as a whole lesson, to go through all of Jesus' teachings and highlight where that through what's called hyperbole, he's making his point. Hyperbole, an exaggerated illustration or point. So what is he saying here? He's inviting this individual who, and notice it's interesting because the text identifies him as another disciple. It could have identified this person as maybe another doubter, or another person who had questions, or another teacher of the law, or whatever, but this is another disciple. That's the word that's used. "Lord, first let me go and bury my father." Jesus says, "Follow me, and let the dead bury their own dead." Here's what Jesus is getting at. And this is a very personal thing for all of us. In order to follow Jesus, we have to understand spiritual priorities. And things that look like they may need to get done may have to be put aside if we're truly dedicated to following Jesus. And that's a hard decision. And the reason Jesus uses this as an illustration is, you would think of how Jesus could have responded. I am so glad that you really care about your family. Go ahead and bury your father. That is wonderful. I mean, why did he say that? Well, he's using this opportunity as a hyperbole to make a point. I want you, if you're going to be my disciple, you've got to get into the habit of figuring out what is your number one priority. And even though there are other responsibilities that may seem to be important, they cannot interfere with your discipleship. And like I said, boy, that's a very personal thing. And I don't always, in my own life, maybe you've already figured this out too, I don't know that there's an easy way always to settle that out. There are things that need to be done, but maybe they're not quite as important as what needs to be done if I'm following Jesus as a disciple. And so you have to sort of weigh those things. And I'm convinced, in my years of studying Jesus, that this is built into the whole process. That God wants me to struggle with that decision, to figure out through prayer and agony and struggle, what are those priorities? So that when I come to that decision, I know it's one I can hang on to and nobody's going to, say anything different. I mean, I've come to that myself. Here are my priorities. I know this is what God wants me to do. If I'm a disciple, this is what I know I need to be doing. Yeah, there are other important things, but this is my priority. And this is where I can put my stake down, and I'm ready to stake my life on it. Okay, wow. Well, obviously we're not going to get through all these, but I just wanted you to be aware of how significant this concept is in the Gospel of Matthew about what does it mean to follow Jesus. Look at chapter 9 and verse 9. And this is interesting because Matthew is writing the Gospel of Matthew, and notice how he writes this in third person. As Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. Follow me, he told him. And Matthew got up and followed him. There's another striking thing in these episodes in the Gospel of Matthew. When Jesus says, come and follow me, the report is real simple as far as the response. They get up and they follow him. No fanfare, no big deal. No entire chapter to describe what it was like to turn loose of your prior life and go follow Jesus. It's just, they got up, they followed him. Just simple response. In chapter 9, verse 27, as Jesus went on from there, 2 blind men followed him, calling out, have mercy on us, Son of David. When he had gone indoors, the blind men came to him and he asked them, do you believe that I'm able to do this? Now, inherent in this story about the blind men being healed is the idea that when we're following Jesus, we recognize that, first of all, Jesus is the one to whom we can go to calling for mercy. And number 2, in our minds and our hearts, we've answered the question, do you believe I'm able to do this? Well, we say to Jesus, yes, we believe you're able to do this. And that's what discipleship is all about. Fundamentally, foundationally, we believe that Jesus can give us what we need. Chapter 10:38. Chapter 10:38. And this is in the long teaching section in chapter 10 of Matthew, where Jesus sends out the 12 disciples to the lost house of Israel. Let's see, what verse? 38. I said 28, 38. Anyone who loves their father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Anyone who loves their son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever does not take up their cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Now, in the past, it's been sort of traditional for Christian interpretation to talk about picking up your cross and following Jesus. And it's been with the idea that the cross is a heavy burden. That's really not the way Jesus is using this. Let's step back a moment and ask the simple question. What was the cross for Jesus? It didn't end up with something just being heavy for him to drag along to go up to the Mount Gethsemane or Mount Golgotha where he was crucified. To carry your cross means you're willing to go through crucifixion, suffering, challenge, agony, but committed with the purpose of God, no matter what, completely giving up self for the kingdom of God. That word cross isn't just talking about something heavy to carry. Think of how it's traditionally people say, well, I just have a heavy cross to bear. Well, yeah, we may have a heavy cross to bear, and there was part of the trip, Jesus had a heavy cross to bear, but that wasn't the ultimate goal of that cross. That cross ended up on the hill of Golgotha with Jesus being crucified, giving himself completely to the will of God. And so when Jesus is saying this, notice it's interesting, he can talk about carrying your cross. He hadn't even experienced it yet. And I've often thought, wow, if you could have sat down with Jesus at this moment and said, now do you realize a couple years down the road you're going to be crucified? He goes, yeah, I'm getting myself ready for this. and all along you'll see in the Gospels where he keeps telling his disciples, you know, it's going to come. I'm going to be crucified. They're like, you don't know what you're talking about, Lord. Well, he did know what he was talking about. And he starts talking about the cost of discipleship. It's with the image of the cross. And that may be why, as I mentioned earlier, this gentleman that I had studied with decided he didn't want to follow Jesus because he understood. He understood the cross. He just didn't want to be a part of it. Well, thank you all for being here this morning, and we'll pick up next week.